I look a lot into implementation and improvement science, which is its own beast in general. But what's so interesting to me is that we take everything and we're separating it all. So we say, this is this thing over here, and this is this thing over here. And it overcomplicates something that was actually intended just to help us change our habits.
Yep.
Because really, MTSS is the systems that support adult behavior change. Because
Yes.
we can't go and tell a student, you know what, you just need to read now. That's not how it works. Like, we can only control our actions and the environment which we create. And that's where systems come into play and can be really helpful, is they help us do the thing faster and better. And so we do overcomplicate a lot of things rather than just saying, okay, you know what, let's just pick one thing and let's just try it out and see how it works and keep improving it.
A few years ago, I started writing a fictitious story based on my time as an educator. It is called Taught, and the story was partially inspired out of anger and frustration fueled by burnout. Okay, actually, it was more than partially inspired by anger and frustration. But Taught has also become a vehicle for me to tell what I thought at the time, and in some ways continue to think, was and is the real story of teaching. I now realize that my perspective is not everyone's perspective, but there are some pieces of Taught that resonated with many educators. This podcast is an extension of that story, and I, a former teacher, will interview other educators asking them to share how they really feel about the current state of education. Why are so many teachers burn out? Why are so many, like me, leaving the field? We likely won't solve any problems or come up with any solutions, but we can create a community of voices that maybe begin the conversation around how educators can take back teaching. I'm Melissa LaFour. Welcome to Taught, the podcast.
I like to be educated, but I'm so frustrated. Hello to my loneliness.
Today is episode number 27, I think. And in at least 20 episodes, MTSS has come up. Most of the time, it did not come up as something that every educator is loving. However, my guest today is going to tell us how MTSS challenged her own ideas of what education should look like from a systemic point of view, helped push her to the burnout door, but not in the way you might be thinking, and has become a passion project for her. But I don't want to reveal too much. That's why she's here today. I would like to introduce Megan Gilchrist, the current executive director and founder of Align ED. Megan has over a decade of experience in the U.S. education system, and she's here today to tell us about her burnout journey and what was on the other side for her. Megan, welcome.
Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited to be here.
It's my pleasure. Tell us about your journey in education. What made you want to become an educator?
Well, what's interesting is that I actually went to school to be a veterinarian, and I got started in that and realized that I loved animals in the kind of cute and fluffy way, but not in the way that you're going to go and tell people something's wrong with their pet. And when you're in your 20s, you're just kind of exploring and trying to figure out what your passion is. And so I was looking at my life, just thinking about all the things I was already doing and what I enjoyed. And I had been teaching swim lessons from the age of 15, actually all through graduate school. And it brought me so much joy. They ended up giving me the courses for all of the specialty classes because I just loved being with the kids and making it fun. And so I said, you know what, let's try this. I love being around kids. Let's see how it goes. And ended up going into elementary education. And through that, had to take a special education foundations course, which I think most people think it's a bore when they get into those type of classes. But what really stood out to me was they did and showed us a person that was nonverbal and how they could utilize assistive technology for the first time, utilizing their eyes, and could communicate and articulate sentences and paragraphs. I thought it was incredible how this type of technology even existed, but then the law really could support allowing people that had this genius in them that they couldn't necessarily show to do that in an educational setting, and how the system really wasn't created for that. And so the intention of special education really was to provide these opportunities for people and for kids, and just really inspired me. So I actually changed my major to special education at that point, and pursued an undergraduate and a master's degree in SPED. I know that it kind of sounds like cliche to call teaching a calling, but I do really much feel that for me, it's always been a very instinctual thing to be a teacher. It's just a place I've always felt really comfortable being around kids, and being in front of children, and the most authentic person when I'm around them. So I just kept pursuing it. I'm kind of one of those unicorn people now. When I look back, that got all their degrees in special education and stuck with it. So, yeah, it's just something that I really felt called to do.
You know what I hear a lot is people, adults and kids, will say, this is how I knew I was kind of called to be an educator. You're really good at explaining things. That's what, or if you're one of my children, you'll say, my God, stop explaining this to me. Right. And I'm like, what a teacher does though,
I
right? We're
I
really
find
good
that
at
so
breaking it
fun.
down and giving the material in those portions that are digestible. So it is a
Absolutely.
calling. And you're actually the first person who has said, I did this because it was a calling. I think most of us feel that way though. Like it's comes naturally, to
Yeah.
want to bridge that gap for people.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
So tell us a little bit about so you decided you weren't going to be a veterinarian. What was your history in education? You decided to go ahead and get the special education degree, and then did you go on to get a special education job?
Yes, so I went straight in after my master's program into teaching high school special ed. I became a high school special ed teacher, and I taught Title I for over 10 years, special education in high school, and then transitioned to middle school after that. So my whole entire career was in teaching.
I love middle school, and I talk about this pretty frequently because and I've been in everything: elementary, middle school, high school. High school typically they've moved on. They are thinking about their lives and what they're going to do, whatever that may be. It's usually boyfriends and girlfriends. Middle school is just this crazy zone where you don't know what you are, and I just loved it. I loved it.
I
But
loved middle school. My heart was definitely in high school. But going into middle school is a really eye-opening experience. And I love to just they're just little kids still, but they're just being
mhm.
super exploratory. And it was really interesting and a great learning experience personally too.
I think you either like it or you're like, get me out. So
Yeah.
that's, that's what we saw in student teachers anyway. So
Yeah.
the podcast here is about burnout. And I'm listening to your story and I'm seeing that you were called to education, and I'm guessing that you are a pretty phenomenal special education teacher. So, what's your burnout story?
Well, I find burnout really interesting because you don't really know what's happening. I feel like it's one of those things that creeps up on you, and it's probably been going on for a really long time, but then you're just get to a point where it's unsustainable. And as I told people, I felt very trapped, kind of like a animal in a cage. That's kind of how I described it at the end. And for me, it was really every single day was just a day. Um, so every single day I was dealing with some kind of traumatic situation or putting out a fire or doing something. And really that came from when you know the most information about your field, then you get more work. So if you're efficient and you're prepared, then and you take 2 hours to do something that takes everyone else 6 hours to do, then they fill that time up with more things. And
Yep.
that's really what happened to me. I ended up in leadership positions overseeing special education programming and departments. And part of that was a choice. I got deemed the bulldog really early on in my career because I always was such an advocate for kids and teachers, and wanted to make it work, wanted to create these things, but then ultimately got put in these positions that put so much on my plate that it was just incredibly unsustainable. For me, what was kind of the end of the road was that I was constantly being put into legal situations that were incredibly reactive. And I began to feel that we're creating unsafe situations for children, for teachers. And these were preventable situations. There was a lot of things that if we would have intervened sooner, or if I would have been brought in sooner, we could have prevented them from escalating to the point that they got. And it was just heartbreaking. I just couldn't do it and to that intensity anymore, where my whole job was sitting in those type of meetings all of the time.
I don't want to
Um,
put words in your mouth. This is me saying this, but I think that, especially in the last few years that I was in education, I saw more people coming into positions that maybe they did not understand the ramifications of the choices that they were making, especially from a legal standpoint, where we would have people come into positions that were not classroom positions, but they had a lot of decision making power over what was going on in classrooms, whether it was hiring people or oftentimes not hiring people to cover things that should have been covered. And it does put everybody in some really precarious situations. I myself ended up in a situation where I took some kids to camp, sixth graders. So you're talking, 12-year olds, 11, 12-year olds, 12-year olds, 12. And one of them had some significant cognitive disabilities, and he was male. And it ended up him being in the shower calling for me to come help him. And I just remember thinking, how did this happen? How did I end up in this situation? And there were a whole series of decisions that were made up to that point, none of them by me, that got us where we were at. So now the student is in a precarious situation. I'm in a precarious situation. And I wish I could say that that was the only time that happened in my career and that I'm the only one that it happened to. And that is just one stupid little example. And I ended up having a male colleague finally show up after multiple calls and go in and help this young man. But there's all kinds of stuff like that that happens where students' dignity is compromised, where a student's safety is compromised. And all it would take is somebody saying, oh, we're going to hire someone to cover this area during this time. Or we're going to talk to the parents about having this particular thing done in this way. And that those calls weren't made. So I want to validate your burnout because it's prevalent and frustrating.
yeah, I really appreciate that. And I 100% agree. There's a lot of these situations that are happening. And from what I saw, is either decisions being made or they weren't being made. They were being passed. And a lot of times those decisions got passed to me, and I was not the person that should have been making them for sure.
Well, yeah, because like you mentioned, a lot of them have legal ramifications within the school system and for us personally.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of things that happen, and I don't know that the public at large understands that some of the decisions that educators can be put in a position to make can make us vulnerable to litigation, and
Yep.
they can't.
And you have to be cognizant of that.
You really do. And that's not a class we have in college, right? I mean,
No.
so how did you move out of burnout? Because I'm pretty excited about what you have to share today because I know you had a journey here. So let's start with that. How did you move out of the burnout zone?
I knew for me that it was, and I have served in so many different capacities trying to figure out how to have a voice. I always say when you're in special education, you're in everyone's business because you have to be. So you sit in this interesting position where you're between kind of an administrator and educators and you see everything. Served on boards, did a lot of things within the system to try to create more proactive solutions, and realized at the end that that was not, my skills were not being utilized in the way they should have been. So I knew for me, I needed to leave to do something different. Um, Kind of moving from burnout, I feel now that I'm not burnt out, it's a lot easier to look back on it and be like, yeah, it's possible. But I think that the actual work that went in, it took me about a year and a half to move out of this place of feeling that I didn't have any control, that I couldn't do anything, that my voice wasn't being heard. And I went to therapy, and I still go to therapy very consistently to deal with those feelings and emotions because some of them are residual. So I moved from education into a different capacity. I was working as a contractor for a company, and really kind of just giving myself grace and figuring it out. And I sought help personally to really move on from that. And I think that that was something that was really important and that I do talk about, because even things like IEP season, when it came up, there was no reason for me to be stressed. I wasn't writing IEPs. However, my body didn't know that and immediately was tense and stressed. And so those are types of residual effects of burnout that I dealt with for about a year and a half after to really move from that.
I think this is what I'm hearing over and over, and even with myself. I think that I was sick and didn't know it was from burnout. I had lots of physical symptoms that I thought, man, honestly, yeah, I'm getting old. I'm just getting old. It's menopause. I had all kinds of
Yep.
excuses for why I was physically feeling the way that I was feeling. And when you get away from the chronic stress and the burnout, you find out, oh wow, that was burnout.
Yeah, I actually had COVID or pneumonia for 3 Christmases in a row.
Holy cow.
Yeah, the first one I didn't have was after I left the classroom,
Yeah.
the first year. Yeah. So to me, that was a very clear sign that I was physically making me sick. I had never been that sick, and for 3 years, it just would not stop coming.
So what advice would you have for other educators that are still in the system and perhaps feeling this?
I love this question because, one of the things and why I'm doing what I'm doing now is that we're always going to need teachers. And there's so many educators that are still in the career that are like me, where they feel very called to do it. And that's what they want to wake up every day and do. And I think that, and I still mentor a lot of former educators that worked for me. And a few things that I think is really important is one, just having really firm boundaries. A lot of times those lines between your teacher heart and your home life aren't always clear. Things like taking your email off your phone, setting a time where no one's allowed to call you or not responding to emails. Also, just feeling that you can advocate and say, just because I'm able to do something in 2 hours and it takes everyone 6 hours doesn't mean I have to fill up the other four with extra
Right.
tasks, and really being able to say no. Um, the other thing that I've always encouraged anyone that's worked for me, and that I do believe this is why I continue to have a really good relationship with a lot of those that I worked with or that worked for me, is that I am a huge advocate of leaving a school and finding a community that better meets your values. If you're working in a community and they don't value, having a family and you have a family, or having time to yourself, or whatever those things are that are really important to you, you can still be a teacher somewhere different,
Yeah.
that does value that. And so I've had a number of people that have left mid-year, and they felt, oh, I'm putting all this pressure on you. And that's fine with me. You have to do what's best for you and your mental health and your sanity to continue in this work. And if that means finding another place that is more aligned with that for you, 100% about it. And I think that that conversation needs to be had more, where educators feel empowered to interview principals just as much as principals are interviewing them in school districts, like that you also have that choice and being able to ask some really direct questions about the culture and the environment and the value that's being placed on them.
Yeah, I think that there's two sides to this coin, right? And I'm really glad that you brought this up because I have worked in schools. Actually, one of the schools I worked in, an administrator said to me, I just don't feel that you are giving the effort that everyone else is. And it's because I wouldn't stay past my contract time. But that school was full of new teachers. They were probably very few of them were younger than 35. I mean, older than 35. A lot of them didn't have families. I had a baby at home, and a lot of them were, they were coaches and they were running clubs, and that really filled them up. And that was the culture of the school. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it was not the culture for me.
Yeah.
So I had to go, and I remember I transitioned to another school, and a year after I had worked there, I needed to take some time off, actually for a vacation, but I needed some extra days. And I remember my administrator saying, "Of course you can take that time. Why wouldn't you? If I had an opportunity to go, I was going to England. If I had an opportunity to go to England, I would do that. Yeah, do it. And I thought, this is so different. But that culture better fit where I was at in life. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. We do need to have a culture that fits who we are. And it's not that it's a right or wrong culture, it's just, is it a good fit for us? And when it's
Absolutely.
not, whew, does it fuel the burnout fire? My goodness. Good
Yeah,
point.
I 100% agree. Different vibes, like I always say it's a vibe thing. You can walk into a building and if you're aligned with the vibe or not and trust those instincts and those feelings. And it's okay to say, this isn't a fit for me. And to find something that you feel. I've had a lot of teachers that have transitioned into new programs and they feel so much more aligned and it makes them feel more energized by that.
Well, that's interesting because I do notice that the name of your company is Align ED, and you just said teachers feeling more aligned. So you are on a mission. Tell us about the direction that you're now going in.
Yeah. So it's interesting the way that I figured out that this is kind of what I wanted to do with thinking about things more proactively. When I first got started in teaching, and I didn't know I was doing this is just something that's natural. I think that everyone kind of has a gift when they transition into trying to be part of the solution, and this is just mine. But I was given the statistic that special education teachers only last 3 years. And I didn't want to be one of those statistics. And as soon as I got started in my career, I started developing systems. I said, you know what? Everyone says that everyone leaves special ed because of the paperwork. So let me figure that out. How do I make it easier to do these things? And so every year I would pick something that seemingly was small, like managing my IEPs. How am I storing them? How am I creating templates? Every year I would build a new system for myself that would just take some stress off of me and I would get really good at it. Anywhere from compliance to one year I did all my co-teaching relationships and how I was building supports for kids and developing those systems over time. When I became a leader, I started doing that for departments and for general education teachers and just saw this huge impact. And that's when I got introduced. It's interesting because everyone thinks that special ed teachers know everything about multi-tiered systems of support, but we don't. And once I started learning the research behind MTSS, I couldn't unsee it. Um, I believe that there's two things that happen in school. Either you are in general education or you are in special education, and that's kind of it. There's no middle ground for anything else to happen. And it created a lot of problems. If one of my students went into a classroom, the teachers weren't trained on how do you provide this middle ground support for a student that has any type of need.
Mm-hmm.
And when I realized that, oh, well, everyone kind of needs help with this thing over here, but then I would look in all the different meetings and go to all the meetings because that was my job, and realize that everyone was duplicating the same effort. So everyone's doing a million of the same things, but in different pockets. And it just seemed like everyone's working really, really hard, but not necessarily because they weren't talking smarter.
Right.
And so one of the things that I realized through the research is that there's a ton of research around what you should actually do and what you should align across schools. And we didn't have to make it up. It was already there. Saying, you know what, if you create some teaming structures, or if you do just say, this is what the data we're going to look at, and this is how we're going to look at it, then no longer is every single department creating those things from scratch. We can just all do them collectively together. And so now I've transitioned to, okay, there's a reality. You walk into a building, and like you said, you were in a school that had all brand new teachers. Well, that's a reality for that school, is that they're getting new teachers consistently versus maybe a school that has really experienced teachers. And then there's a best practice where the research is saying this is how it should be done. The frustration that a lot of people are finding is that the best practice is being pushed on them without realizing there's a reality to what can actually be done. And so what I'm doing now is help bridge that gap. How do we look at your current circumstance and situation and listen to people? That's a big piece of it. Listen to what people are saying. You know what? This is taking up so much of my time. This is frustrating me. And how do we create realistic systems, protocols, and solutions to help make that work easier? So that way we're not having to work so hard.
And this is what makes you an MTSS. I'm going to use the word
Yeah.
specialist, right? Yeah, that you're looking at those systems. So it's interesting today for me in particular. I have an adult daughter who's 33 years old, and she and I are going to do an episode actually this week. And we've kind of been looking back at her school career because she has epilepsy. And we just recently discovered that she has a very rare form, a genetic form of epilepsy called sunflower syndrome. And as I look back at her education career, um, the piece that you just said, so much of it is not the label that we put to the strategy or whatever the current thing is that we're implementing, but it is listening. And you just said that. It is listening to what the educator's needs are. It's listening to what the student needs are. And sometimes we just really overcomplicate that. You know, it's not that you need to. I just read another article that was, I'm not going to name the system, but it's the top one that everybody's talking about right now. That everybody's doing it begins with a U. And it is, here's this lesson, and here's 100 ways to design it so that you're following this methodology. But what if you don't need to design it 100 ways? What if you just observe actually what your kids need and listen to that? Not to, and I know that's not MTSS and all of that, but when you said listen, it just really struck me that sometimes we overcomplicate things by giving them an acronym or saying that it needs to be a certain way when it is the same research. I mean, I don't know what research specifically you're looking at, but every time the only reason I'm going to be honest here, the only reason I research any of this is for my podcast or when I was in grad school to make some point that I thought needed to be made. And then I'm going back into the archives. But if you start doing research in education on any topic, it hasn't changed that much. The brains are still working basically the same way.
I 100% agree. And I love that you say we overcomplicate things. I I look a lot into implementation and improvement science, which is its own beast in general. But what's so interesting to me is that we take everything and we're separating it all. So we say, this is this thing over here, and this is this thing over here. And we never, and it overcomplicates something that was actually intended just to help us change our habits.
Yep.
Because really, MTSS is the systems that support adult behavior change. Because
Yes.
we can't go and tell a student, you know what, you just need to read now. That's not how it works. Like, we can only control our actions and the environment which we create. And that's where systems come into play and can be really helpful, is they help us do the thing faster and better. And so we do overcomplicate a lot of things rather than just saying, okay, you know what? Let's just pick one thing and let's just try it out and see how it works and keep improving it, by separating it all out. And I could go on about this, but I went on a state website recently, and there was 3 different handbooks from 3 different departments utilizing the same research, saying the same thing. So you give that to an administrator and say, good luck, you do all these 3 things. They don't have time for that.
Right.
So we're putting so many different theories and research best practices in front of people and overcomplicating it in a way that it actually just never happens.
Yeah, and it does make teachers have that, here we are back at burnout, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
here's this new thing where I have to hand in my lesson plans every week showing that I'm doing this one thing. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I had I'm going to call it the misfortune, because I wasn't that good at the position, probably wasn't qualified for it, yet there I was. I
Mhm.
was we called it English as a second English speakers of other languages, ESOL program for an entire district on top of my English language arts job. So that speaks to how important this was for this particular school district. We did not have that many speakers of other languages. So basically I was a test coordinator, because they have to take a test every year, right? So they wanted me to basically coordinate the testing and any para support or teacher assistant support that these students were entitled to. And I found out really quickly that the bulk of my work was working with other teachers. I mean, that's what it boils down to, right? And there's no shame in this game. We get stuck sometimes. I did myself as a teacher, where I'm like, I'm sorry, I know how to teach this unit. I've done it 10 years this way. I want to do it this way again because I know what I'm doing, right? We don't want to get out of our comfort zones. And I get that. But sometimes we have to. Sometimes we're using methods that are not appropriate for whatever outcomes we're trying to achieve. And so as you're speaking again, I'm taken back to that moment where I'm sitting there telling teachers, you don't need a translator. What you need to do is offer these supports when the students in your classroom have some vocabulary so that they can try to keep up with what's going on in class. But they didn't want that. They wanted to teach the way they had taught, and they wanted a translator to interpret what they were saying and doing in the classroom to the student who couldn't speak the language. So it's sometimes a Herculean task to do the work that you're doing, which is on that end of things, is making someone see that, hey, maybe there's some things that you could do a bit differently.
Yeah. And I find data incredibly important. And I think that we put too much in front of teachers and ask them to do too much with data. And we're also not using it intentionally. So that's one of the first places I start a lot of places, with the schools and districts, is really looking at the intention and use of data, so that we can be responsive to it. I think when you actually see it for what it is and where you're doing well and where you can improve and be really reflective and focus on improvement of our practice as a reflective practice versus well, you know what? We're going to judge you and you're going to get this evaluation. And if you don't meet it, then X, Y, and Z is going to happen. I think we have to have an improvement mindset. And that's a big shift that has to happen.
Absolutely.
And mindset is a resource and we have to treat it as such. Um, and so if we can talk about it like it is a resource and not something where if you try something new and it doesn't work, now you're in trouble. I mean, we have to get rid of that type of thinking and really look at it from a reflective practice and that we are experts in this and we're dealing with humans and humans change and just like we change and we have to be willing to shift and move with it.
So I have a friend who does burnout workshops, and she said one of the most intimidating things about it is you walk in and she said, I can never say the phrase self-care. She said, as soon as I say it, everybody's like,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you run into that when you say MTSS.
Well, what's interesting is that MTSS is something that we've talked a lot about rebranding because the branding is just terrible the way that it's been rolled out. And part of it is just naming what it is. You know, I always say there's an elephant in the room. Let's talk about it before we get going because I want to know what you feel. And then we're going to talk about what is the actual realness behind MTSS and why it was created and how it's supposed to work. And let's talk about that, how that mindset can shift and how we can kind of mold it. But I think part of it is naming that this is something that has been rolled out terribly. And particularly MTSS has been treated as its own initiative. So it's another department. It's another extra thing that people are doing rather than it being the funnel to which everything comes through. Like the whole point of creating systems is to make people's lives easier. So if you're saying we're doing this new initiative, you should actually think about the systems you're creating to help support the initiative. But that's not how it's been rolled out. And so I do find that when we go in there, everyone has a certain mindset, but I have presented to hundreds of educators on MTSS and have seen a huge shift by just naming that this is something that has been poorly done. And let's talk about it first, and then let's talk about where do you start in doing it.
This concludes part 1 of a 2-part interview. Please join us next week for part 2. Thanks.
I wish I knew.
Today's episode was produced and edited by me. The theme music is by Otis McDonald featuring Joni Inez.
But I'm so frustrated.
If you know someone who might enjoy these conversations, please share the podcast episodes as much and as often as you can. It's as simple as copying the link you use to access today's episode and sending it in a message or sharing it on social media. I'm a small independent operation, and your shares broaden our audience. Perhaps you or someone you know will be inspired to talk about teacher burnout. If you would like to get your voice on my podcast, contact me via the link on my webpage, taught.buzzsprout.com. Coach, speaker, and author Rashid Ogunlaru said, "It may take many voices for people to hear the same message." Join me in being one of the many voices rising up to get the message out around educator burnout. This is Melissa LaFleur. Thank you for listening to Taught, the podcast.
Play our roles and ignore the problems. I wish I knew.
I have an important reminder/disclaimer to share. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Content provided on this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as professional advice. We encourage you to do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the information discussed in this or any other episode. Additionally, any opinions or statements made during the podcast are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you for tuning in.